What is up, boys and girls? Welcome to one of the final episodes for Project AP1 S2000. This is our all-motor tuning series. For those of you that are just tuning in, the previous few videos we did a bunch of all-motor upgrades to my already built all-motor setup in attempts to make more power and fix some of the issues with the old setup. So to give a quick recap, previously the car, it was my 126,000 original mile F20C. I pulled the engine from the bay because the valves are pretty caked up with oil and they weren't sealing too well. So I refreshed the head. I did an entire SuperTech valve train, including their titanium retainers. I threw a set of Brian Crower stage 2 cams in there. While I had the head off, I milled 15 thousandths from it, and I ran a spoon thinner head gasket, which the stock head gasket is a 3-layer MLS, and the spoon version is a 2-layer. So it was a total of 27 thousandths off of the head. Why did I do that? Because when you lower the compression, or I'm sorry, the combustion bowl, and the piston comes up higher into it, you raise static compression. So stock compression ratio is 11:1. That puts compression now to around 11.7:1. It may actually be a little bit more. There's not really any clear calculations for the S2000 specifically, but I'm kind of basing that off of what I gained from my all-motor ITB Miata, which was about a quarter of a point for compression for every 10 thousandths you took off of the head. So for bolt-on modifications, the car was running a J's Racing exhaust manifold into a 70mm T1R test pipe, which was then mated to a 70mm dual NVIDIA Q300 that I did a lot of modifications to. One, I added a bigger resonator into it to quiet it down, and two, I cut the internal silencers out of the muffler to make it a true 70 to 60mm exhaust setup, and I put a set of Schedule 40 tips on there also to try to keep the noise down. The whole setup is tuned off of a Haltech Platinum Pro plug-and-play. I have a J's Racing intake system on it, and then I also have lightweight ancillary pulleys, so the water pump and alternator pulley are aluminum, and it has a fluid damper, fluid-filled lighter crank pulley, and then out the back it has a 7-pound Fidanza flywheel and an OEM Honda clutch and pressure plate. So I want to keep the setup all motor. I was trying to pull as much power out of this all motor as possible without actually touching the bottom end. I'm not a big fan of going into bottom end work because as soon as you take those rod caps off for the connecting rods, for the bearings, you open up a whole slew of variables for the motor, and now reliability kind of goes out the window. Honda did a fantastic job with the F-Series motors. I think they're one of the best, if not the best, naturally aspirated production 4-cylinder engine. And yes, I do like them better than the K-Series. If you look at the way they did the cam system on this, I think it's much nicer design than what they did on the K-Series. Not to mention you get the low friction fiber reinforced material cylinder sleeves, which help aid the high RPM nature, and the stock pistons are very thin. They're kind of like a pancake piston, more similar found in Formula engines. So very, very cool motor. I want to keep true to the characteristic of the car and see what I can make naturally aspirated out of it. A stock healthy AP1 S2000 dyno somewhere around 195 to 200 at the wheels on a dyno jet with corrected horsepower. The setup that I just talked about, tuned on the Haltech, made 222 horsepower at the wheels and 148 foot-pounds of torque, and that was standard correction factor on a dyno jet. So there was definitely some meat on the table over the stock engine, pulling, let's just say for the sake of comparison, 22 more horsepower if we had a perfectly healthy F20 in there. The car was quicker, but there was some things about that setup that I didn't love. We lowered the VTEC engagement point down to 4,000 RPM. And what would happen was there would be a little bump in power after the engagement, but then there was a dip in the dyno chart, and you'll see that in a second when we overlay it. And then the power would ramp back up right between 5,500 and 6,000 RPM. You kind of felt that there. The cam felt lazy. So I was looking at ways to redo the setup. I had a lot of conversations with Alex of Balladesports. He has done a decent amount of development on the S2000 platform, and I tried a bunch of his parts for the new revisions. In the previous videos, we go through installing each and one of them and talking about more specific comparisons to what we were replacing it with. So if you want to get more details, please do go back and watch those videos. So the new setup, I am super pleased and super happy with the results. Peak horsepower is now 238.5, let's call it close to 239 at the wheels, and torque is up 10 foot-pounds to 158, but the gains in mid-range were huge. And if you look at the dyno graphs, we're gonna overlay them now. I highlighted a section here around 3,800 RPM. You could see the car is making 21 more horsepower and 31 more pound-feet of torque, which is unbelievable, and it is totally seat of the pants noticeable. The car is a completely different animal now. We're gonna drop a video real quick to see this car on the dyno and hear it. We're gonna do that right now. Much improvement overall. This is how an S2000 should feel, and I would say this is probably a realistic, easy mid 13-second car, maybe even lower with a hero launch. I mean, it's properly fast compared to a stock S2000, and I'm super happy with the results. I love it. But let's talk about the power gains and why they got there. So, a couple things. Alex's header, it uses different pairing than the factory header, and as well as the J's Racing manifold. J's Racing does a 1-to-4 and 2 and 3 cylinder pairing, which is the same as stock. Ballade does 1 and 3, 2 and 4. So it's a different pairing. Again, I'm not an engineer here. I didn't sit there and dyno different tubing lengths, primary designs, and pairings to like see what's optimal, but I think Alex was onto something with this. I have seen some other videos out there showing that that header made a little bit more horsepower than the J's, so I was tempted to try it. I'm glad I did. I think that the stepped primaries that is used on that exhaust manifold attribute to some of the low-end gains, for sure. J's uses a 2-inch primary right off of the header, or right off of the cylinder head, where Ballade does stepped. I don't remember the measurements off the hand. I think it's their own sizing. I remember VTEC did pairing on their manifold, but the primaries are smaller on the VTEC than the Ballade. I just don't remember the exact measurements off the top of my head. Ballade moves the first merge collectors down farther than the J's Racing manifold did, and the last collector at the end is kind of similar to both. I'm sure there's differences, but just looking at them side by side, they're pretty similar. Secondly, the camshafts. So we went to Ballade's camshafts that they developed for the S2000. They had put a lot of emphasis on the primary lobes, so the non-VTEC lobes, trying to allow you to run more horsepower up to the VTEC ramp-up point. That is probably also where some of those mid-range gains are, because my compression is higher, I'm making it I'm taking advantage of that overlap that may be introduced by the higher lift and higher duration that the primaries have. So I'm making more power down low because of that. So remember, when you're going bigger cam lobes, especially when they're longer duration, you introduce exhaust and intake overlap more than what's there from the factory. You bleed off compression. So typically with bigger camshafts, you want more compression to make the best use of them. There has to be some give and take somewhere. Usually that comes at a little bit of sacrifice for the low end, but I think the stock S2000 primaries are very mild. So, you know, there's definitely meat on the table there, especially with the raised compression that I have. Now, speaking of the cams, the Brian Crowers that were in here, they have very aggressive VTEC loads, but the primaries are close to stock. So let's talk about the dip in power that I saw on the graph. My theory is that even with my raised compression, turning on that big VTEC race lobe, let's call it, right? Let's call it what it is. It's a race camshaft lobe. At 4,000 RPM, the engine is not spinning fast enough and doesn't have enough compression to work through the overlap that's introduced. So you're introducing a rush of air and you're introducing more overlap at a RPM where like the engine isn't quite spinning fast enough to take advantage of it. So that's where I think that a lot of that dip came from. Alex's cams, which have a more mild VTEC lobe, although it's still more aggressive than the stock VTEC lobes, allowed me to lower that, keep my lower VTEC engagement point, and him and I went back and forth a lot on this, and we thought that originally that I was going to have to keep it around 5,000 to 5,500, still lower than stock at 6,000, but to really like kind of let the primaries ramp up and then have a smoother VTEC engagement point. Well, we tuned both ways. We tuned the non-VTEC primaries up to 6,000 RPM, and then we tuned the VTEC turning on as low as 4,000 RPM, and we did back-to-back runs to see what happens. Well, even turning it on at 4,000 RPM, not only did I get rid of that dip in power, you can still see power remains consistent. At 4,000, the primaries would actually taper off a little bit, but the VTEC lobe carries the power, and I have a very smooth transition, and the bump in mid-range was awesome. Now, a little caveat that I want to say about that. I'm getting away, most likely, with the VTEC lowered because Alex's best results were mostly about 5,000 and above. I'm getting away with that because of the raised compression in the engine. So be wary of that if you're switching to those camshafts and you still have stock compression. So there is something to be said about the raised compression. It allows me to turn the VTEC lobe on down at 4,000 and not have any weird dips in power. So that was something to make note of. Lastly, we used Alex's adjustable drive gear. And I think that the reason why we experience so many gains, like I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the header and the cams are going to make 30 more horsepower down low and you know, as whatever I made 15 or 16 more peak horsepower. You have to be in mind that yes, I do think that they did something over the old setup. I do think that what Alex has designed here is definitely better, and I'm sticking with this. But when I shaved the head and I ran the thinner spoon head gasket, that causes your stock cam timing to become retarded. In doing that, you lose power. Now, Alex had to develop that drive gear to account for the stock timing chains stretching, which also retards your cam timing. The correction gear fixes that, and it gives you back that little bit of horsepower loss that a stock engine will experience over time as the chain stretches. The chain that's in this motor is 2,000 miles on it now. There's nothing on it. So take the stretching out of the equation. I went with the adjustable gear that Alex does, which allows 3 degrees of advancer retardation. We obviously want to advance it. But when Matt and I were installing everything and we set my motor to top dead center, you can clearly see that the crank mark is not at the TDC mark when the cams are at TDC, and vice versa. When the crank is at TDC, the cams are not in TDC. And that's because of the shave that I had done to it and then the thinner head gasket. So there was definitely power on the table because of that. I ended up with almost that gear pretty much all the way advanced. It was like 2.5 degrees advanced to get TDC where it should be, lining it up visually. So it definitely corrected what I had lost by doing that. I've always been a fan of shaving cylinder heads. You guys who follow me and know my Miata build, I took a 100th off of the head, which is like unheard of. Nobody's ever done that before, and that's a lot of meat. It's a non-interference engine, which is part of the reason why I was able to take so much off. S2000 is already interference, so you can't take as much, but I basically bumped my compression on my Miata from 10 to 1 to 12.5 to 1 without ever opening up the bottom end, and that was the beauty of like what I did. It saved a lot of money by doing that. Yes, there's compression gains to be had, but you have to be wary of how it affects cam timing. I don't think on the Miata it affected it as bad, but again, I have adjustable cam gears on there, and we just tuned those on the dyno to wherever they made maximal horsepower. But on the S2000, it's probably more sensitive to it, and there was definitely meat on the table. Clearly there was, because when you look at the new setup, it's unbelievable. And going into this build, I said I would be happy if I can hit 230 wheel horsepower, which was 8 shy, you know. But the fact that we're 16 more wheel horsepower peak is unbelievable. And you can see, when you look at the end of the graph, you can see power starts to taper off a little bit more sharp than it did with the old setup, and that's probably the byproduct of the cams having not as aggressive of a VTEC lobe, but my peak power is still higher. And it's getting close to the end of the RPM range anyways, so it doesn't matter. You know, I did question whether keeping the Brian Crowder cams with the timing corrected, what that would be like, but I love the low end gains that I got, and I think that, you know, Belade cams really help that. And the same thing with their exhaust manifold. So I'm not going to touch this setup. The only thing that I may consider doing from here on now is individual throttle bodies, because I do think with a good intake manifold setup, I could probably break 240 wheel horsepower, it'd be 245, which would be stupendous for a stock bottom end F20C. But overall, when we're talking, you know, this is primarily a street car, but I do track day stuff here and there with it. But this power, the way that the power is delivered now, having such a bump in mid and low, like the low end and mid range, I mean, it is noticeably faster everywhere. VTEC sounds properly angry now. It didn't sound as angry before, and that's, you know, turning on the cam, that aggressive VTEC lobe that low and not having the compression to deal with it. It was just very lazy there. It didn't sound like that, you know, that VTEC pop that everybody knows and loves. The whole setup just works so good, and I'm like so happy with this. This was like literally the best horsepower per dollar spent when you look at what I spent on everything for the first setup. Now, is the J's Racing header bad? No, I still think that's a good exhaust manifold. I think that the J's Racing header can deal with bigger displacement engines and also very aggressive camshafts and high compression because of how big the primaries are. Could be wrong, but that's just kind of what my gut feeling is. But for even a mildly tuned, I don't know if this is considered, is this mild, Matt?
Yeah.
I think
a head shake is mild.
I think this is mild, but some people said this is like a lot. Whatever you want to say, right? I think that the Belade header is the best header that you can get for a setup like this or to mild or stock. I think it's gonna give you the best gains like everywhere. But yeah, I'm stoked. I'm not going to talk too much more about it, but Matt and I have a good test. Last year we raced the S2000 with the old setup. With his Genesis coupe, and we were pretty neck and neck up until like what, 100 plus, when the Jenny's horsepower advantage would start to pull ahead.
Yeah, maybe 80, 90.
Yeah,
maybe it was up there though.
but we were like kind of closer. I was like, oh man, like I almost feel like I'm gonna win, but I didn't. Matt's car would start to like edge ahead just a little bit. I have a great advantage in weight over the Genesis, but Matt has the horsepower advantage, and you know, at speed horsepower matters. So this should theoretically be faster now. If we were that close before, I think it's going to be faster. So we're going to try to get out and do a drag race, just like, because that's going to show the closest comparison. We'll show you the side-by-sides for that. So one of the things I forgot to talk about is that before this little mini-series, I switched my custom 70 to 60 millimeter dual to Alex's S-type exhaust, which is a kind of a recreation of the old ASM 70 millimeter single, which was known at the time as the quietest 70 millimeter exhaust for the S2000. I was a little, you know, worried that that might cost a few horsepower over the previous exhaust setup that I had. And whether it did or not, I don't know, because I didn't dyno just the before and after by strictly the catback change. But let me tell you, not only did that exhaust drop another 19 pounds off the car's weight, but it is tremendously quieter than the system that it replaced. And the fact that I still made these numbers and have a very quiet, street-friendly S2000 is unbelievable. So, Belade, thank you very much. Alex, you know, I was apprehensive based on our conversations, but you know, the proof is in the numbers and the proof is in the setup. So you were right, and I appreciate everything. We had a lot of good technical conversations and a little bit of, you know, contradicting opinions, but hey, that's what makes the automotive world so good, is when you can speak with somebody respectfully, you know, and share your experiences and like kind of like brainstorm to come up with a formula. So overall, I'm super stoked. Check out Belade. I'll give them my blessing on this. I'm a believer in their products now. I never really experienced them before in the past. I knew who they were, but I'm happy that I reached out, and I'm just so happy with the final product. So guys, thank you so much for tuning in. If you like this content, give us a like and a subscribe. If you think it sucks, let us know in the comments too. Matthew will respond to you and give you some sort of sarcastic response. But check out our webinars on slipanglemedia.com. It helps support us. We give away tuner parts. You just have to pick up seats. You get to join Matt and I for a private session where we review the parts, and then we do like a little Q&A. We get to interact with you guys, and one lucky winner, or anybody who has a seat in the giveaway, you can have multiple seats. They'll get the part for free. We draw it live during the webinar. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you all in the next one. done.